Hola, amores. I just recorded a really long review for Wretched, but for reasons best known only to itself, my computer had moved the default microphone from where it normally is in the drop-down, and running on autopilot, I clicked on the wrong thing, and the whole review was silent. So this will be a faster recap with less prevarication and circumlocution. So today we are looking at the Wretched role-playing game Core Book from the Red Room. Web search for them, it's the Red Room backwards. You'll find their store, and they rely on sales through their own store and a few independent stores now as well, having been kicked off drive-through, which was an unfortunate state of affairs. So this is the generic or all-encompassing rule set for all of their various settings. This is the key that unlocks their various settings, such as the Belle Epoque in France, the Old West in Wretched Country, and so on. Disclaimers. I know the Red Room. I kinda got them their start in publishing, so you can blame me for all of that, for which I deeply apologise and take full responsibility and, of course, credit. They are friends. We still have a somewhat tenuous financial relationship. They've given me work. I've given them work. I sell some of their older edition products. Yeah. That's where we are with that. So yeah, I know them, we're friends. I got this book for free, and the newer editions of all their setting books on PDF for free. It's also unfortunate but necessary that I have to present an additional disclaimer. The Red Room and some of the people who work with them have some regressive viewpoints, shall we say, or have been made hostile to certain people because of the trauma and attacks and censorship that they've suffered. I do not agree with the vehemence and venom of some of that backlash, while also understanding it, and I prefer to stay friends with people who I disagree with and be a positive influence on them, and no doubt many of them feel the same way. You should try it. Be friends with people who disagree with you. Disagree amicably, even on important things. And you may well find that they soften and that you grow to understand people different than yourself in better ways. I hate that has to be done, but if I don't do it, someone will stir up shit in the comments, and it'll be a bad show for everybody. Alright, so the Red Room have carved themselves out a little niche, doing heavily genre-influenced OSR games and material. Now, it's not genre in the sense that you might be thinking of, in that we're not just talking in terms of science fiction, fantasy, horror, but rather particular types of fantasy, science fiction, and horror derived from what's called low art or ephemeral media. Ephemeral media being things that were never meant to last, that were never necessarily meant to be fantastic quality. But nonetheless, due to the sheer volume of things that were created, there's a lot of gems in amongst the muck. So here we're talking about things like penny dreadfuls, giallo films, and books, pulp novels, old comics. Old comics, the old pulps, the paper's acidic, so it eats itself over time. Old film stock, especially cheaper film stock, succumbs to vinegar syndrome and breaks down. And vinegar syndrome, incidentally, is also the name of a company that seeks to preserve a lot of these old films by putting them on on Blu-ray and so on. Now, I like this kind of stuff. I like those trashy paperbacks from the 80s. I like trashy Sean Hudson horror novels. I like grindhouse cinema. I like the pulps, all of that. So I'm a bit of a fan, and this is what they do really well in their setting books. And because old school rules are kind of like the lingua franca or the Rosetta Stone of role-playing games, it does make it all quite easily convertible to other systems, particularly OSR, but beyond OSR as well, because most of us, for good or ill, have a familiarity with Dungeons and Dragons and its various rule sets, which makes it an easy way to translate things to other systems. This is the second edition of the game. Not a lot has changed. It's a refinement rather than a complete overhaul. Mostly it's down to OGL fiasco protection. Remember, we started out the year with the OGL fiasco where Hasbro/Wizards tried to put the genie back in the box so far as the open gaming license was concerned. And Gamers Rise Up was actually a thing, and they backed down for now. So words, terms, and so on are changed in here, but it's still going to be familiar to you. If you can handle Dungeon Crawl Classics and their changes in terminology, then you can handle this. You can handle the Wretched rules. Now, this is a generic rule set. It does have aspects of their various different settings. I think that's a good idea, having a core book, because that also means that in any future setting books, they can devote more time to the setting, which is the area in which the Red Room really excels, in my not so humble opinion, is in their treatment of setting, respect of setting. They don't try to retcon history. They wear their influences on their sleeve. They love and respect those influences as much as I do, and that's a big part of the appeal of what they produce. And so this move will allow their source books to be more expansive, more in-depth, more in detail, without losing so many pages to individuated rule sets. Other things to consider about the rules: hit points are much more set and are based on your toughness, or constitution if you prefer. As characters progress through their levels, they do so in smaller amounts, but it is more meaningful. Yeah, a hit point here or there, a skill point here or there, but characters don't change drastically, meaning that as a player you can get a real sense of change and accomplishment by small changes without your character becoming super powerful. Characters are also individuated much more. There's a lot more different ways in which you can customize your characters. And so two characters that are ostensibly, fighters can come out at the end being wildly and meaningfully different in a way that they can't necessarily in Dungeons and Dragons itself, in any of its incarnations other than maybe 3rd edition, or many OSR games, which I think sacrifice a lot of complexity and individuation for simplicity. Yeah, it's a design choice. Things here are still quite simple because the bonuses and penalties are kept quite small, but there are a lot of different ways to customize your character, which is something I really appreciate. In terms of universal selling point, the main thing of the Wretched verse, besides the backgrounds of the worlds that they've created and derived from aforementioned ephemeral media, is the idea of sins and virtues. These kind of replace alignment, though you can mix and match it with alignment, but they give a sense of direction and purpose to the characters and encourage the players to roleplay in ways that are true to their character, will make things more difficult for them, but which will perhaps also reward them. Perhaps, responding to my feedback, they have made these things more impactful than they were before. I think before you used to get an XP bonus if you played up your virtues or vices. Now you can get access to a wild dice. Now, wild dice you can choose to spend. If you roll odd, it's something negative happens and you take the number away from whatever it was you were rolling. If it's even, then you get a positive bonus and something good happens. So by playing into your vices and virtues and having them cause difficulties and complications for you, you can access these wild dice. I think you all start with one. The GM starts with one for each player. And that just allows little twists of fate, a little bit more survivability if you're lucky, for your characters who are otherwise fairly vulnerable. There's a lot of options throughout the book that can make things either more difficult or easier as you go along. Like damage can be exploding dice, which I quite like because it increases the value of lower dice type weapons because they're more likely to get those exploding dice of damage. You know, you can stab someone half a dozen times while they can get one sword swing in, and having an exploding damage dice is a nice way of representing that, though it does make things much more deadly. But I like my combat deadly and, more importantly, quick. I would say. It also strikes me that wily games masters could use this mechanic in a way to encourage players to engage with certain parts of the plot, certain things that you would like them to explore in your adventures as you go along. Maybe this is the influence of Japanese RPGs, which are much more structured. I think it was in Tenrabasho Zero. You can explicitly kind of tell the players, I want you to engage with this plot element, this NPC, you know, and if they do, then they get a bonus. So it strikes me that you could also use the subsystem and sort of write out little cards or something and put them out. So if you romance this NPC, you will get a wild dice. If you engage with this side story or side quest, then you will get a wild dice. Things like that. It might be a nice way to kind of shape the game a bit. Incentives. That's what it's all about. Players will do just about anything for any even tiny incentive. Further customization comes with character backgrounds and aspects of those backgrounds, life path events. The character background is unweighted, so it's a straight roll. You know, underclass, lower class, middle class, upper class, elite, you know, sort of thing. And it's an even roll, which is fine for player characters, but for NPCs you'd want a more weighted table, I think, because there's far more of us plebs than there are elites. It's fine for player characters, though. Life path events help you round out a character and kind of structure that background without you coming out with a huge novel for your character, which doesn't tie to your statistics at all. It's random, but you could allow people to choose if you wanted to, I suppose. You could, with your occupation, which is like your class, you have that occupation, and then there's usually at least two, and usually more sub-archetypes. So if you're an assassin, you might be a hired hitman, or you might be a serial killer, which kind of goes to show how dark these games can be in a lot of ways. If a serial killer can be a protagonist, if you want to see that done very well, I would suggest reading Alan Moore's run on Crossed. And there's another one where one of the survivors in a group is a psychopath. But that's, yeah. If you like splatter and horror, then Crossed is a very good comic series to read. Races were appropriate. You've got different alien races, different fantasy races, mutation tables for certain other subtypes. Characters get perks and drawbacks, which are somewhere between feats and merits and flaws. So yeah, for an OSR game, you come out with meaningfully diverse characters that aren't just cookie-cutter optimized things. This is a generic book, generic rules. with subsections for their different worlds. They're likely to come out with additional settings and so on, which are still going to need their own rules to an extent. So maybe we'll see them follow the DCC model and put out new versions, revisions of the core book over time. I think that would certainly be worthwhile as they continue to expand their work, and it's a business model that clearly works for Gooden Games. So why not new editions, but new printings with refined content, refined presentation, and so on over time. It is an OSR game, and OSR has certain advantages. Network externalities. What we mean by that is that, like, if you're writing for Dungeons and Dragons, it is the biggest game on the market, and it is something that most people are familiar with. A lot of people think role-playing is Dungeons and Dragons, and Dungeons and Dragons is role-playing. So if you're producing material for D&D, you have the potential of tapping into that huge market, even where the system is inappropriate for what you're trying to create as a game. This is why we see so many inappropriate games. It's why, you know, the D20 boom was as it was. The OSR is similar in that it has a lot of network externalities, probably second only to Dungeons and Dragons, and then only because of the open gaming license. Because the OSR is it's like dogs. Dogs are very plastic. They can be very different and still be dogs. You know, you can have a St. Bernard and a Chihuahua, and they couldn't be more different, but they're still both recognizably dogs. They have doggy traits, right? And in a similar way, OSR games can be very different, but they are still dogs. Hopefully you get what I mean by that. And certainly they've bent and twisted old school systems in a lot of interesting ways in the Wretched verse and in the Wretched core rules. But it is generic rules with very little background, and that always has drawbacks and it always has advantages. The example of this is probably GURPS, which had fantastic source books for all kinds of things. Personally, I didn't much care for the GURPS system, but you really can't fault their source books. They're brilliant. And going through this version of Wretched and being more familiar with the OSR than I ever wanted to be, I never started with D&D. I do not have the same nostalgia that a lot of people have, but being more familiar with the OSR now, I can see the presence of certain influences from other OSR products and feedback that they've gotten, and egotistically I'm going to assume some of that was from me. So this represents progress, OGL proofing, and a different approach from the Red Room to future releases, I think. Drawbacks? The layout could be better. I find it a little bit too spaced out. I think the font size could drop a point, which would save pages and allow pages for future expansion. It desperately needs an index. It has wholly inadequate contents, which doesn't really help with referencing. So yeah, how much use is this going to be during play for reference? I don't know. Not that useful. It also might be an idea to reproduce certain tables and rules in the back for easy reference. When I've been streaming games recently, I have been constructing cheat sheets to present to the players to show them how the system works, and to have something quick for me to reference myself. And I'm also finding that to be a very good way of learning systems. As I get older, the brain is slowing down slightly. I can't just absorb rule systems as easily as I once did, so I find preparing cheat sheets for games to be very useful for learning systems and having it stick in the old noggin But yeah, my one major complaint about this book would be the lack of an index. Presentation, yeah, there's progress, but it could go even further. For some of you, AI art and its presence is going to be a problem. The Red Rooms seem to have gone for a more hybrid approach this time around. There is some AI art, but they have trained their model on art types that suits their products. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. It's like having a very, very cheap in-house artist who can churn out spot art at a rate of knots, but they have intermingled that with stock art and with commissioned pieces. This is probably where I think a lot of indie producers are going to end up with this kind of hybrid approach, a mix of AI to fill out where you can't afford any more art, stock art where you can find appropriate pieces, and commissioned art for sort of statement pieces. I love the cover very much, very pulpy, very weird. My favourite piece in the whole book is, if I can find it, is this piece in the combat section, which shows a scantily clad barbarian chick diving at a weird looking Jabberwock, I think, vaguely. These pieces are slightly cartoonish, but I really like them, and where appropriate, I would like to see more art by that artist, please, very much. But yeah, so it's not all AI art, something the Red Rooms was somewhat notorious for when they were churning out their products to start with. Now we have a more nuanced hybrid approach, which, again, like I said, I think this is where most people are going to end up. And they're using their own AI model, which allows them to create a visual language and style for their games, which I also appreciate. There's not really a reason for me to review their setting books again, as the judgments I already made on those is going to largely be the same. The mechanics changes are in this book, so I think my reviews of their settings, which was mostly about the settings, are still very valid. Let's give it some scores then. In terms of style, a high 3, I think. I think there is improvement, but the walls of text are not broken up particularly well. I think the font size is slightly too large. There are still improvements to be made in terms of layout, efficiency, and reference. But the art is good, all of it. The AI stuff is good, the commission stuff is good, the chosen stock art is good. In terms of substance, this is a rules book. It's all substance, pretty much. So I would give it a 4 out of 5, because they haven't gone entirely generic. It's not entirely a toolkit. It is a basic set of rules with the various genre-specific rules slotted in by genre. So perhaps not quite as useful as it could have been. Not presented as well as it could have been. Yeah. So substance 4, style 3, substance 4. That's 3.5 out of 5. That's 7 out of 10. And just as a reminder, because some people don't seem to understand, on my scale, a 3 out of 5 is average. A 5 out of 10 is average. An average score is good enough to buy if you're into it for whatever reason. If you love the system, if you love the setting, if you think that whatever producer it is produces stuff that you particularly like, then anything that achieves an average score is worth getting for you. Anything that scores an 8 out of 10 or higher, 4 out of 5 or higher, is recommended in general for one reason or another. Something you should probably invest your time and money in if you have either to go around. So with a score of 3.5 out of 5, this is above average. But what it is, as I said earlier, is this is the key to unlocking the setting books and material that the Red Room puts out for the various genres based on ephemeral media. And so for that, it's worthwhile. This is an above average score. So if you're into the OSR, if you're into ephemeral media, it's definitely worth getting. If you're not, then maybe it's not, but it still has value beyond just appealing to its niche, I think. Hopefully that explains my scoring better. Zang. Pulp Nova is a collection of short stories in the old pulp style but with a modern twist. You should find something here you like, from western to mythos horror to science fiction. You can get Pulp Nova at Drive-Thru Fiction, on Amazon, or in hard copy from lulu.com.